All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Maher Mata. You've probably seen my YouTube channel and all 16 of you. And you've probably seen my reels on Instagram. I really appreciate your support. I've been having a lot of fun with that. Today I'm doing something a little bit different for a change. I'm in author Steve Borges' garage. He's a distinguished pilot, flew for a major airline for 30 years.
32 years, yeah.
So he knows a thing or two about airplanes. As you can see here in the garage, there's a couple of displays. And I'm excited to be talking to him today. He wrote he described it as a very ambitious book called Flying Crooked. We'll get to that shortly about the book itself. But I'm honored to have Steve Borges with me today. We're in Eastern Shore, Virginia. Beautiful. It's a bit humid outside today, so it's kind of nice to be indoors in the AC. Steve, thank you for joining me for my first interview on YouTube. This is exciting. Maybe this will turn into a permanent thing for me. You never know.
Oh, well, I hope so.
So tell us, Steve Borges, why Flying Crooked? Why Flying Crooked? Why'd you write this book? Number one, why'd you write it? And number two, I'm really curious, how long did it take you to write this thick book?
Well, I wrote it, Maher, because I was really, I wanted to break the mold, so to speak. Typically, when aviation is a theme in writing, particularly with a novel, whenever it's a theme, writers are forced to turn to tropes. And by that I mean bomb on the airplane, terrorist on the airplane, criminal mastermind plotting its demise to the death of all on board. They turn to those things because they don't know where the drama exists outside of that in commercial flying. And it's important to remember that everything about commercial flying, whether you're flying freight or people, particularly with people, is designed to take the drama out of it.
So the themes about terrorism and whatnot gets a little bit overdone.
Yeah, I think it's overdone, but writers fall back on it because they don't know where else to look for it. And that includes many pilot authors as well. Unless you've had the type of experience that is expressed in the novel, or I've written about in the novel, and I have had some experience. In fact, my experience was so far off and away and out of bounds that if I told the true story, no one would believe it. I had to actually fictionalize it to make it believable.
So what ultimately inspired you to write a book? I mean, after being a distinguished pilot for 30 years, plus you had other experiences before your airline industry experience, like what motivated you to write it? Well, I mean, you mentioned the themes that were getting a little bit boring with aviation, which I've had a close friend of mine, Alex, you know him, he's a pilot as well. He mentioned the very same thing.
Right.
So how did you decide, all right, I'm writing one that no one's written yet?
Yeah, and I can't say that nobody has written that because there's 12 million books out there. Right. Millions more are coming online every year. But as far as I know, there's not. No one has written aviation the way it's been written about here, commercial aviation. Military flying, the drama is built into it. They're flying dangerous airplanes and dangerous missions, and that doesn't even include the combat that they have to fly. In civilian flying, it's all about keeping things safe, reliable, and comfortable. So how do you develop the drama? Well, the drama is there, but you have to know where to look for it. And what inspired me to write it was, well, first of all, I'm a lifetime reader. I love fiction. I've been a reader of fiction all my life. And the more I read, I began to realize that our story, the story that I'm telling, our pilot story, has never been done like I've done it before. I mean, the closest thing that you can come to is Fate of the Hunter by Ernie Gahn. That was written in 1962, still in publication.
Wow.
And it's a memoir. So it was a very challenging thing I was attempting to do, a very ambitious thing, particularly as a debut author. I'd never written a book before. I'd done some short stories and done some technical writing, but never anything like this.
Was it as hard as you thought it was going to be? I mean,
yeah, a lot more difficult because the problem is you're trying to create drama authentically. And to create drama authentically, you need authentic people, which are not people who are trying to kill themselves. They're not doing things deliberately for dangerous purposes. And the best summation of that, I think, is in the epigram of the book, a quote from one of John Dryden's poems. And that became the premise for the novel, that we're drawn to this danger, we're drawn to these tests of our skills and ability, and our ability to pull it off sometimes borders on madness. So it's that thin partition between skill and madness genius and madness that fascinated me. And that became the premise for the novel.
Sounds like stand-up comedy, frankly. Genius and madness. But you have to write it in a way that you're enjoying to write. It's something that you would like to read.
Exactly.
But it's also something that someone, it's like stand-up comedy is the same way. I got to find it funny, but also they have to find it funny.
Exactly.
And that's how you have to write. You have to write in a way that Steve would read it, but also would the person sitting right there read it.
Exactly. And that was the single greatest challenge, because to create it authentically, you have to get rid of everybody understands a bomb on the airplane. We don't want to die. But when you're not on the airplane, when you're not even a passenger on the airplane, how do you create the drama? Where does the drama come from? Drama comes from conflict. The conflict has to be carried throughout the novel. So where do these conflicts come from? Well, the conflicts come from the pilots trying to do a mission that in itself is very difficult to do, particularly for a small airline with limited resources. So that's what it was. And then at the same time, to create authenticity, you need to get into the technical detail of it. If you're going to describe the cockpit, you can't just blush over all these technical aspects of it, because a lot of that is where they're doing things wrong, where you're creating the drama. The difficulty is trying to make that work for the average reader, person outside of that. And I'm very happy, very pleased to think that after 20 years of pursuing it, I was able to achieve that. And I know that because I've been invited to a number of book clubs. All these people have had no aviation interest whatsoever, and they all thoroughly enjoyed the book.
20 years of pursuing writing a novel?
Writing a novel, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's in the acknowledgments, it tells that. It all started over a dinner conversation 20 years ago. And
can you tell us a little bit about that? Who was that? What was the nature of that?
Well, it was my sister-in-law, and we were talking about the things I had done flying the Hajj in 1978. And she said, that would make a terrific book. And I said, well, yes, it would, but how am I going to make sense of this? Because unless you're there doing it, or it makes sense to you, how are you going to make sense of it to the public at large?
So that single conversation planted the seed in your brain.
It did. And I began the writing, and I began to realize I had at least a little, a room temperature talent for doing it. But there's a lot more to writing fiction than most people are aware. I mean, fiction, like building a home, requires an architecture. There's a structure to it. And before you ever put pen to paper or finger to a keyboard, you must understand what that structure is, or you'll likely fail. I mean, if you take out hammers and nails and a saw and you start building a home without a plan, without understanding what makes a home work, you're likely to wind up with something unoccupiable. And it's the same thing with fiction. You have to understand the architecture first, and then you have to make all these other things conform with that.
If you look at a stand-up comedy set that's, let's say, an hour long, I've had people say, like, how did that comedian come up with that entire hour of material? And really talented comedians can start you at the first minute, and they'll bring it back to that first minute at minute 60. So it almost turns into a big story, which they call like a callback.
Right.
So similarly, when you're writing something like this, you're having to think, okay, what's going to happen next? How do I bring it back?
Exactly.
What's the next chapter going to be? No wonder they call it writer's block, because you have to get to a point where you're like, what the hell am I going to say next?
That's why very often along the way I was stuck. How am I going to connect this? How am I going to make, and not only connect it, but make it realistic?
Yeah.
It has to be authentic.
Yeah.
And I'd get stuck. I wouldn't know quite how to move on, and then eventually it would come to me. And then I'd start to write that. So at every stage, to keep it not only authentic, but to keep it interesting, engaging, and thrilling, it has to start with a setting. You have to develop a conflict. Conflict rises to a crisis, ultimately to a climax, and then a resolution. And in every great story, all those elements are there, and in more or less that same order. Now, the story might be 90% resolution and 10% conflict as it works its way through. It doesn't matter as long as the reader finds it engaging and the author is able to pull that off. But in most cases, it's a little bit more measured. It's measured in even phases as it works its way through. So you're right. It all starts at the beginning, and then the overall architecture is to start here, as you just described, and wind up back at the beginning.
So there had to be points when you were pulling out your hair.
Oh, many times. 20 years, a lot of it was because it was sitting on a shelf dead. I didn't know how to go on. I hadn't resolved how am I going to move them to this next chapter? How am I going to move them to this next phase and do it realistically? I had a copy editor who's published author, has written a number of books, and he was helping me with it, and he kept trying to push me through these things, and they were all contrived circumstances, and I didn't want that. They weren't going to be contrived. There may be fateful, serendipitous circumstances that brought the character to that next phase, but they had to be realistic. It had to be, other than that, it's not fiction anymore, it's fantasy. And then you can write it any way you want, knock it out in a month.
Again, that reminds me of stand-up comedy, where you say something and someone goes, "Oh, there's no way that really happened."
Right.
And people have said that to me after shows. They've said, "Oh, that story, there's no way it's true." But what's interesting is the stuff that they can relate to is what they like the most in stand-up comedy. So you had a lot of challenges, and you're proud of it, obviously.
Yes.
20 plus years ago, the seed was planted. I didn't know that. I didn't know that you got that seed planted.
Yeah.
Because I've seen you working on it. I've known Steve for some time now. I've seen you working on it, but I never really thought, all right, what does it take to write a novel?
Well, I mean, and I'm not Flaubert by any chance, but when he was writing Madame Bovary, a friend of his had visited him in his office one day, and the friend was looking around, and he said, "Are these all your books?" Now, Flaubert was bemused. He looked at him and he said, "No, that's Bovary." It's all revision and rewriting and revision and rewriting and then honing it down and narrowing it down and getting the story to its essence, developing each character so they're consistent and yet three-dimensional. It's a lot of work. Writing is hard work. There's no author in the world who will tell you that it's not.
Oh, it's a ton of work. I mean, it's like painting or something. I mean, it's not just slapping paint up there. I mean, there's more. When you write something, when I write comedy, you have to, just like I said before, you have to think about, is this going to be entertaining to me? Is it going to be entertaining to them? You get to a point, and maybe you got to this point in writing, where you thought, no, damn it, this is good. You know what I mean? There's a couple of jokes that I've written, and I go, no, and I've run it by people who have said, I don't know that. I'm telling you, this is going to work on stage.
Right.
Similarly, when you're writing something, if someone tells you, well, I don't particularly like that part of this section, you go, yeah, but you're not the actual reader. You are someone who I'm asking. But when someone's actually sitting there reading it, it's a different ballgame.
Right.
It's like running a joke. If I run a joke by my wife and she goes, oh, I don't know, that's not that funny. I'm telling you, it'll work on stage. Maybe that happens when you're writing a book.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, particularly if I've set it aside for a long time and let it cool, as writers said. Put it aside and then come back. If it's still making me laugh, if it's still
interesting,
choking me up, then I know that I've succeeded. If it's been a long time since I've read that passage and I'm engaged, I wrote it, and I'm drawn into this, I want to know what happens next. I want to turn the page, and I already know that I know the writing's good. And it wasn't until I got to that point that I was willing to publish it. And I can't say it's perfect, and But
I was going to mention that a second ago about perfection, because I think with any kind of writing, you get to the point where you go, all right, I got to stop trying to make it perfect. There's no such thing as perfect. Even the best films in the world, we take The Godfather. Someone can go, yeah, but they shouldn't have done this particular scene this way, or they should. And I'm sure anyone who writes a movie or produces a movie can go back and go, yeah, I just wish I had changed that one tiny thing. Now, looking back at it 10 years later, I should have changed that one small thing to fix this particular issue or that.
Well, and that touches on why I've self-published the book, because traditional publishing for a debut author pretty much limited to about 90,000 words. If they get a manuscript that's over that goes right to their slush pile. And they're going to assume it's overwritten, poorly edited, it just needs a lot of work. Even if it's a great story, they don't have the time or energy to put the effort into it, especially for a no-name author. And I was trying very hard to keep the novel as concise and cut down to the minimum that I had to and still tell a story as much as possible. And I was at 130,000 words, and I had just come to the end. And it was time to bring it to a logical and sensible conclusion. The greatest compliment I've ever had about the book is from people at book clubs telling me my only thing about it I didn't like is I didn't want it to end.
That's a good problem to have.
Yeah, I think so.
I've noticed in stand-up comedy, people will often dissect the material so much that I'm annoyed at that point, because they'll dissect it so much and tear it apart so much And then I wonder, well, did I not do it right? Did I say something weird? Maybe they're right, maybe. But then it comes back to similar to writing about your point of view. Right. At the end of the day, this is Maher's joke. This is Steve's book. And I'm always fascinated when people are sitting talking about books, they'll say, I love the way this author writes. And they can read that, you can read a book and go, that was written by Joe Smith or whoever. Right. That was written by so-and-so. Just by the way they're writing. I mean, it's still the English language. Right. But it changes so much, the point of view changes so much. If you play a joke online or read a joke online and you don't know who the famous comedian is, more than likely a comedy fan can say, oh, that's a Dave Chappelle joke. Right. And not necessarily because they know the joke, but because they know the way they write.
In writing, we call it the voice.
The voice. Same exact idea.
An author has to develop a voice.
Yes. It's amazing to me that you can take a book without a cover or without a title and start flipping through and go, oh, this is so-and-so author.
Yeah, I can. I mean, not 100% of the time,
but you can get really close.
You certainly, if you have favorite authors, you will recognize their voice. You'll know how they're telling their story, and you either like it or you don't.
But their voice has to change over time. I mean, if you write a dozen books, book one is not going to be in, you know what I mean? It has to, just based on life experience itself.
Well, the book and the plot, the characters and such may change, but chances are the syntax, the overall flow of the words, the word choice, the character development, you'll probably recognize that in subtle ways.
Now, I want to put you on the spot here a little bit. Can you just give us 90 seconds of your professional experience as a pilot? Where did you start? Where did you go?
Well, a lot of that is in the book. And
I don't want to give too much away.
I understand, but it is... So in my late teens, I got lost. A lot of us were back in the 1960s and the 1970s. I went from the honor roll in high school to basically flunking out. I'd lost interest in school, lost interest in everything. And then on top of it, applied, after 4 years in all-male parochial high school, I applied to an all-male military academy. I'm not trying to make any sense of this, but you can see, in fact, the words flying crooked has the adjective crooked has two meanings. It means either something not in a straight line or something dishonest. And I tell people by the ripe age of 21, I'd achieved both. You know, okay. I was going all over the place. So my point being is that I'd gotten very behind the 8 ball. And then I had gotten a 59 lottery number for the draft, and I wound up in Vietnam, a service I'm very proud of, but came back and decided it's time to start getting serious. And I decided at that point, because my dad had been a pilot, and I'd always knew I was going there, I just had to get there in my own time and in my own way. I decided I'd fly, and I'd use my veterans benefits, my VA benefits, to pay for my flight training. Problem is that by that time I was 22, and I'm already very behind the 8 ball in this very, very competitive career.
At 22?
Yeah, at 22, because airline hiring at that, back in that era, had you reached the age of 30, you were done. They wouldn't hire you. Okay. Yeah, 30 years old, you're over it. They're finished. Because you had to retire at 60, and they want that amount of time to amortize the cost of training and hiring and all the rest of it. And they didn't want you past that, and they didn't have to hire you past that.
So you're 22, you're already pushing that age.
Yeah, I was already pushing it, and I had a long way to go. I had to develop the experience needed to compete with all the thousands of highly qualified military pilots that were coming out of the service at age 26 or 27 after their first complete tour in the military, with all the qualifications the airlines were working for. They were college educated, they were exceptionally well trained, they flew complex, sophisticated and fast equipment. They had all the stuff that the airlines were looking for. And here I come along, I'm a veteran, I had that going for me. But I'm flying low-performance airplanes, and just before, as you'll follow in the book, I'm flying these antiquated World War II vintage DC-3s, flying freight. There was no comparison to a guy flying F-4s off the Nimitz, or C-135s, or any of the rest of the high-performance military equipment. So I had a long way to go. I was down on my luck, behind on everything, and up against the clock. So I had a long way to go, and I managed it. I finally managed it. Yeah, I pulled it off, and I was hired by American Airlines when I was age 26. It was a dream come true.
26 years old, hired by American Airlines.
Right.
At 26 years old, I was very bald. As you can see, author Borgess here is not bald at all. He's 106 years old, folks. He's 100. No, I'm kidding. He's not. That's really, really, really impressive stuff. I know when you're in your 20s and confused and just come back from Vietnam trying to find a career, you certainly did that, which is why we're doing this video now about Flying Crooked. You can get this online.
Yep,
you can get
Amazon.
You can get it at Amazon. Please take a look at it. It's excellent. Had nothing but raving reviews about it. He's very proud of it. We are too. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. This has been an honor. Folks, check out the book. Make sure you do. It's excellent. Steve is an amazing guy. He's had, as you can tell, he's had quite a life, quite the experience throughout his career. And we certainly are proud of this book. Make sure you check it out. Check it out on Flying Crooked Steve Borges. Thanks, everybody.